In this lecture module, we'll shift gears into the final component of the lecture. We'll talk about definitions as semantic artifacts, as static tools created for the specific purpose of fixing meaning in the context of a language. So we'll talk a little bit about the role of definitions in discourse, the structure of definitions, how they accomplish their goals. And we'll talk about 5 common types of definitions, with the exception of lexical definitions. All of these definitions fix meaning, but they also have an additional goal, an additional thing that they want to accomplish. So we'll talk about stipulative definitions, precising definitions, theoretical definitions, lexical definitions, and persuasive definitions. Then we'll talk a little bit about whether or not definitions should be understood as truth functional. Are they true or are they false? Are there contexts in which we should construe them as true and false, and contexts where we shouldn't, and so on. And then we'll end this lecture by talking about the relationships between definitions, concepts, and words. So definitions are these static semantic artifacts. They are these tools that we use to fix meaning by reducing vagueness and ambiguity, by introducing new terms into a language, and so on. So by definition, traditionally, one means, by definition, attempts to fix the meaning of a term in the context of a language by reference to other terms in that language. So for example, when Ronald Reagan was president and there was this entity called the Soviet Union, Reagan said of the Soviet Union that it was the evil empire. And the then head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was perplexed. He's like, what do you mean we're evil? What are you talking about? So Reagan could have gotten up and said something like this. Mr. Gorbachev, fix the reference of that term by equating it with other terms having well-established conventional conventions. And tear down that wall too. So you may say, yes, that's all fascinating again, Wallace, but what good are definitions to me? Definitions are appropriate and useful additions to discourse when the consumers of your argument appear to be unfamiliar with the relevant use of your terms in your argument, to remedy ambiguity or vagueness, to otherwise clarify and make more precise the connections between ideas in your communication and in your argument, and even in your own inferences and thinking. Likewise, when you're unsure of the relevant meaning of a term in somebody else's argument or communication, definitions can prove illuminating, and you should definitely ask people for definitions if you're not sure what they mean. Now, definitions don't just have the goal of fixing meaning. Sometimes they have additional things in their agenda, things that they want to accomplish. And so we're going to look at 5 different kinds of definitions and talk about how they differ from one another. But first, let's just get a fix on what definitions are. As I've said, they're semantic artifacts, they're tools, they're static structures, and we'll want to take a look at the way in which they accomplish their goal. So every definition has 2 components to it. It has the definendum, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying the word or phrase to be defined. And it has the definens, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying the words or phrases that do the defining. And every verbal definition then equates the definendum with the definens, providing a person with an intentional formulation of how to go about identifying the reference of a particular term. There are a number of different common types of definitions, and they differ slightly in what they're trying to accomplish. So a stipulative definition is a definition that's trying to fix the meaning of a term in a particular context. It might be because there are multiple possible meanings. It might be because they want to introduce a new meaning of a term in a particular context. It might be because they want to define something or name something that heretofore hasn't had a name or a meaning. A precising definition is a definition that tries not just to fix meaning, but it tries to take a word that is somewhat vague and is imprecise in its application, and it tries to refine it to eliminate some of that imprecision, some of that vagueness, usually for a specific purpose. Now, a theoretical definition has the goal of defining that term, of giving you a conventional connotation for that term, but it wants to give you one that gives you a deeper understanding of the term. And so it will go to a theory, some theory that is relevant and useful for gaining a deeper, more profound, or more contextualized understanding of the term. So I could define water as the odorless, colorless, tasteless chemical that quenches thirst. And that's perfectly fine. That's how we normally talk about water. But I could also give you the molecular definition. By water, I mean the chemical compound H2O, in which I use chemistry terms, the theory of the chemical molecular composition of water, in order to give you a deeper insight into the phenomenal stuff that is odorless, colorless, tasteless, and a liquid which quenches thirst. Lexical definitions, of course, give you the meaning of the term within the context of some linguistic community. We might define monkey as a non-human primate mammal. Now, lexical definitions don't just exist within a single community. Sometimes there are sub-communities, there are specialty communities, and lexical definitions can cater to the meanings, the special meanings of those terms. For instance, there's the Urban Dictionary, there's a hip-hop dictionary, there's all sorts of specialty dictionaries that give you the meaning of terms in a specialized context. Finally, there are persuasive definitions. And persuasive definitions attempt to define a term in a way that introduces a positive or negative emotional connotation. So a persuasive definition is essentially trying to introduce a bit of emotive meaning into the term, usually to for or against some particular term that is being used. So, for instance, animal rights activists will often say things like meat is murder. So all of these definitions help us to fix the meaning of a term in the context of a language by eliminating vagueness or ambiguity. But none of these definitions will work unless the person already has some facility with the language. We cannot define a definendum if there are no terms that we can use to formulate a definends. So we can't tell someone what a word means if they can't understand the words we're using to explain it. What do we do in cases like that? Say a person learning a second language, or a child learning a language. Well, what we usually do in circumstances like that, and in others as well, is use ostensive definitions. Ostensive definitions are the extensional meaning version of these intentional definitions that we've been using when we give verbal definitions. With an ostensive definition, a person defines a word or phrase by pointing to instances and giving the person feedback to help them formulate and refine their understanding of the term. When you're teaching a child what a circle is, you don't say, "Oh, look, Johnny, a circle is a set of points equidistant from a center point on a Euclidean plane." No, you show them circles. You show them big circles and small circles and red circles and blue circles until they get the idea that a circle is this kind of shape. So are definitions then truth-functional elements of our language, or are they not? Well, strictly speaking, definitions are fixing the meaning of our terms. They aren't, strictly speaking, things that are true or false, but rather conventions or guides, norms about how to use terms, about how to regulate our usage so that we're in harmony with other people. And so, in many ways and in many circumstances, definitions are just conventions and shouldn't really be understood as truth functional, having a truth value, a true or false. Instead, we should think of them as guidelines, as conventions for how to go about using a term or identifying a reference. However, in some circumstances, we must construe definitions as truth functional, as having a truth value. So oftentimes people will use definitions as premises or conclusions in arguments. And in this context, the assumption is that this definition is an accurate description of the class that it defines. defines and hence can be used in a truth-functional fashion. Oftentimes, theories in physics are equating individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for some phenomenon. In philosophy, for example, we define knowledge as justified true belief. We have three necessary conditions. It has to be a belief, it has to be true, and it has to be justified. Individually necessary, and when they're all present, they're jointly sufficient for that belief to count as knowledge. In the last little lecture module, I'll go over some practice problems to help us clarify and refine our understanding of some of the terms that we've introduced in this lecture.